Welcome, welcome. Welcome back to the Gothic Heart. Today's episode has a very, very interesting guest. I've got Ben here, and the amount of information, education, benefits that he has to offer and talk about are far too many for me to just remember and tell you about on my own. But luckily, he's here. So we're going to have him introduce himself. And I'm really excited to go into all of the very exciting things that he's an expert on. So, Ben, let's take it away.
Love it. And I'm going to steal benefits because a good pun is a good pun, right? I love that.
Absolutely.
First of all, thank you for having me on. My name is Ben Stimpson. I'm an author, a therapist, a spiritual practitioner, and a folklorist historian. That's part of my life right now. Lots of hats. They all intermingle, and we will certainly talk about it today. So that's who I am.
Well, I'm so glad to have you here. I know we briefly talked before the show, but for our listeners, I wanted them to know that there were certain parts of Ben's experience and expertise that I was really fascinated in. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And first is your book. You've got an entire book that you wrote about ancestral veneration, which I started looking into, and it's so fascinating. So I would love for you to tell us about that, what it is, and how it involves daily living, or just all about it.
Of course, definitely. And I made the mistake. I didn't bring the book with me to show you, so I can't even show.
Well, we'll put the links below. We'll post it. We'll post it.
So the book came out in September. It's called Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Developing Ancestral Veneration Practices. And the best and easiest way I can explain this to people is, we talk a lot about grief work. We talk a lot about mourning work. Both of those are rooted in a belief that the dead are gone and incapable of still being part of our universe and world, right? Ancestral veneration is a very different way of approaching the dead, and that is understanding that they are still with us in some way, in some form, and still capable of interacting with us. And the best way of seeing that is the movie Coco. So Pixar's Coco is based around the Day of the Dead, right? Mexican Day of the Dead. The idea that every year the Chicano and Mexican culture puts together a special day towards the dead. They build altars. They invite the dead back into the house in the same way that the Chinese, many African traditions, many Catholic nations actually have the Day of the Dead, right? It's something that the Western world and Protestant Western world has lost sight of. And the funeral industry has certainly helped that push the dead into the dead zone, and we don't have any connection with them. So my whole book is, how do you build a practice around working with the dead from a perspective that they are still accessible, they are still here, and that you still have access to them in everyday life, in the same way that when we die, we will still have access to the living. How do you do it in a safe way? How do you do it in a culturally relevant way? How do you do it in a spiritual way? But there's also aspects there of psychotherapy and psychology in there too. So a whole book designed to build a practice, basically.
And that just sounds so exciting. Side note, from previous episodes that we've done, so we've had someone that talks about being in the death industry. She was a jeweler that incorporates ashes and memories into the jewelry for people. So that is, sort of a tie-in here. Also, we had a psychic on that can hold the jewelry and the stories and things that remember. Obviously, it's jewelry based. I'm a jeweler. So this is really fascinating. It's just like a next level up. And I love that you tied it into Coco. One of the episodes we just did, we were tying into Inside Out. So we've got all kinds of parallels with cartoons here.
Pixar are just like knocking it out of the water. I use Inside Out a lot with my psychotherapy work because it's a perfect example of parts work, right? And like emotion work. Right? Love it so much.
That's what we were talking about, was parts work, and that's exactly how it came up and how the new one's about to come out. So that was really cool. So Coco is a great explanation, a great way. I like it to just sort of make it understandable to the people that are listening, or just anyone you talk to. So your book, you said it's about how to build a practice. Is it like your individual self, or how to do it and help other people?
It's how to do it and help other people. So
Okay.
I have my own spiritual practices that I engage with. I'm of a British background, even though I live in Canada. You can put it on our accent. So my cultural traditions, my cultural legacy, my lineage is all British, going back at least to the first last 500 years. Some of my spiritual experiences and the traditions I've been part of have been African-based, have been kind of New World-based. And so many of the traditions around the world, when you really look at spiritual traditions around the world, the vast majority of them have some form of way of catering to the ancestors as spiritual beings, as a class of being that needs certain attention. Right? In the same way that people go to church, go to the temple, go to mandir, go to wherever, right? Or for the sacred shrine or whatever to work with God's angels and spirits. In the same way, most of those traditions also have a component or a spiritual practice connected to working with the ancestors. We used to have this. We used to have this in the Western world 100, 150 years ago. Practices like, going into the graveyards and, lighting the candles around the graves, sweeping the graves out once a year, right? Enjoying, spending time with the dead. And then the funeral industry came in and removed that from us and made death very much a different thing. It's this weird thing that we do. When somebody dies, what do we automatically do? We always talk about them in the past tense. They're relegated to the past. Right? They're gone, they're not accessible. The vast majority of the world, that's not the common norm, right? Even at mostly at the folk level, not so much of the kind of main tradition piece. So what this book does is it introduces people to the world view, and then it takes you this whole second section, which goes through almost all the aspects of a living practice. What is shrines? Right? What is the use of color? What are you doing when you're, relating to the spirit world? What is some of the safety features? What rituals of safety can you bring into this work? Because there are definitely dangers whenever you work with the spirit world. What are some of the emotional components, right? In going on pilgrimage. These are things that we all do instinctively. We fill our houses with images of our dead. Right? Whether it be our biological dead, whether it be those people who are really influential to us, our lineage ancestors, right? Or our affinity ancestors. We often will go to places that, we know that our dead came from, whether, again, biological or not, right? This is particularly true of people in North America going on pilgrimage to, the homeland over, unless you're Native American, in which case then this is the homeland. But it really is that piece around connection, relationship, and reinvigorating that, however way you want to see it. So that's what the guidebook is really about, asking good questions. I like to think of it almost like therapy session between you and your dead, bringing you back into relationship, and relationship in action, which is ritual, which is activity, which is going to a psychic medium and speaking to them, right?
I love that. This is what I love about having guests on, is because I start to think of a bunch of things in all these different ways and how it applies to me just in my life. Didn't think about it in the way that you expressed it right now, but even just before, like the way I was brought up, Jewish, you go to Israel on your birthright trip and you stay on a kibbutz and you do, it's just something you do. It wasn't put in those terms, but the way you explained it, that's exactly what it is. So
exactly what you
that's
do.
really interesting. And I know I had mentioned this to you before, but New Orleans is one of my favorite places in the world to ever go. And the shrines that you speak of, the altar and that connection to the dead, and the cemetery tours, and just the way that they're honored, and even the funerals in New Orleans, I put that in quotes for listeners, sorry, are celebrations, parties throughout the street and everything. So I've always really found that fascinating. I even tell people, or my husband and my family, like that's what I want. I'm like, I want a New Orleans style funeral. But it's just so basically you're sharing with us like what that means and how to do that. What kind of, as a therapist, and we work with people on their mental health, what kind of benefits or what kind of improvements or things that can we see by incorporating that?
A lot of what I work with is family trauma. right?
Okay.
And cultural community trauma. And I can give you a very good example of this. So coming from a Jewish background, going to Israel, right? Going back to the homeland, right? A friend of mine went and first time going back after many, 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 many years, and they went to the museum of the commemorating the Shoah, right? Walking into that space, seeing those images on the wall, seeing those faces, seeing those names, placing stones, right? I blanking on whether or not that's one of the traditions of placing a stone in that space, but I know that that's one of the traditions, right? You automatically have that connection to these people, this mass of ancestors who were suddenly and very quickly just gone, right? That memory piece is a way that not only does the culture and individuals play out and work on that trauma, but it's also then tying and feeding that need of those ancestors to be remembered, of those ancestors needing to have that story told and to have their individual stories told. So we take that and we can apply that to our individual family lines. And this is something that I think a lot of cultures around the world do. They just don't necessarily realize it. Because we tell the stories of our family, we tell the stories of where we come from, our roots, and in that way, it allows the kind of intelligence of the family to perpetuate itself, to go forward, to grow, and for you to feel a part of. So there's that trauma piece, but there's also that finding our own individuality within that, right? Many of us come from traumatic family experiences perpetuated by the family, right? Many of us come from not so great things because those people who were perpetuating that trauma themselves came from not so great things. So that idea of learning the separation between ourselves and that family story, which might not be a great family story, right? I'll give you a very good example from my life, right? When during my psychotherapy training, I had to do a family history of myself and to look at patterns and behaviors of family stories, narratives that are passed down in the family culture. And one of those things that I saw in my family line was 5 generations, 6 generations before, 2 of my paternal and maternal grandfathers were in the workhouse. And the workhouse in the UK, in England at that time, 1850s, was a debtor's prison. If you didn't have anything, if you were bankrupt, if you were just destitute, you would go into these places and they would keep you alive, but you would have to work for it. And it took you a long time to get out of those prisons, those debtors' prisons. And from that was generated on both sides of my family a narrative of being a self-made person. And that carried down through the line as being an entrepreneur, being self-employed, a big one, right? So a lot of them, my ancestors went into the trades. Of course, what happens with that is workaholism, alcoholism, perfectionism, all of these really negative things that are associated with high-intensity work like that came down the family line. And so it's there's no question why both my parents ended up coming together, because they saw in each other that same kind of work ethic in the family. But it was very, very negative to family culture. So understanding that piece just from a family history point of view unlocked a few things for me. But then from an ancestral veneration practice point of view, actually being able to go to these ancestors to gain answers as to why. Why was this allowed to perpetuate? What was the hardships that you had to go through in order for me to be born? And I gained a lot of insight, a lot of empathy and compassion for people who were just trying to do to live, but also causing issues as they were trying to do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's so that understanding. Well, I mean, I heard you say it. So learning that and understanding it caused you more compassion and more empathy. Or that I feel like that's really speaking to me right now, just because with parents, just in general, right? When they're either getting a little older and more disabled, them having to do a lot more. And of course, I'm yearning for my life before having to do that, right? But this understanding would probably give me more compassion, more empathy, which I keep telling myself I need, but I'm not getting. So It really
We
speaks to me
get
what you said
caught in
there.
that story, right? We get caught in those stories because oftentimes family cultures are developing, especially dysfunctional family cultures, they develop in such a way that they will ostracize anyone who threatens the status quo, as even as unhealthy as that status quo is, right? And in the more collectivist culture that you get, the more that dysfunction can become a big thing. We see this a lot in individualistic cultures too. The drive to be an individual, to be, everything is dependent on us succeeding, us individually succeeding. It causes a lot of pressure when you come from, a family culture background which is more collectivist, where the needs of the family outweigh the needs of the individual. Right? There's a lot of pieces to that. Yeah.
So this is I'm seeing the connection right here, the way you're explaining it. It's a lot of how it's tying into what I know we're talking about more unusual ways of therapy, but how it's actually going to help you and improve your life, or understanding, compassion, empathy, because we are in past episodes and we talked about traditional therapy and then a more holistic approach. And then, so this is yet another option for people who have different beliefs or different lifestyles, or just if nothing's worked before. Like, I love how this is tying, and everything you're talking about is tying into still helping ourselves, our mental health, our family, etc. Because we're happiest when we are all functioning on a better level, right?
We are. I mean, I see this all the time. It's one of those things, but I think it's one of those things. This is the Western kind of psychotherapy model, which is not as conducive to collectivist cultures when you look at it, is again that onus on us being the healthiest, us being the best, us becoming the most sound. What ancestor veneration can do is put us back into connection with a whole community of ancestors going back millions of years, right? We're part of that whole, and that whole is still there as a support for us. One of the things that a lot of African traditions will say, and it's this saying in particular comes from Cuba, but ancestors are the ground that we walk upon. Where we walk is up to us, right? And I think that's really, really big, because it helps us to understand and also affirm that boundary between our lives and our wearing what's called the mantle of life. We're living right now. We get to decide which direction we're going. But we're supported by all of those that came before us, both the negative, the unhealthy, and the healthy and the positive, right? All come in one big bow, because we're eventually going to be part of that group. So it's that run-on effect. And I strongly think that when people feel, because of our brains, right? Our brains are designed and they're built in such a way to be social in nature, right? That's why we're not like a single lion, or a single tiger roaming around, right? We're a pack animal. We're a social animal. We do better when we have community. What a lot of people do, though, is when they don't feel community with their family of origin because of trauma, they go and find their own communities. We all do, right?
Yep.
This is putting us back into that greater community of ancestors that transcends those more unhealthy elements. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
It's an excellent way of putting it or explaining it to a novice
I'm word
such as
walling
myself.
right now. I apologize, but
no, it's making me understand and seeing it in myself and thinking the different ways, which is exactly what we wanted you on here to do, was help open our minds and show alternative options and things depending on what we're going through. And so the ancestral veneration that we just talked about, etc., and you are also a practitioner of magic. So do the two go hand in hand? Like, if I bought your book and I was going to start practicing these things, would I also be learning about that as well? Or how do they tie in?
Absolutely, you would. Yeah, absolutely, you would. There's a big distinction, though. So this is where it becomes a more nuanced conversation. So the idea of magic, the basic idea of magic, is that we are able to, through ritual and through practice, through sympathetic connections, this idea of Jungian synchronicity, right? That the whole world is connected through very subtle strings, all attaching everything to each other. Magic is essentially the study of and the learning of how to pluck certain strings in certain ways to affect change. right? That's what all magical thinking is all about. And magic is something that we all do anyways. Whenever you wear a lucky, like baseball players, right? Whenever they wear lucky underwear or lucky socks, right? Right? Or when you wear, a certain amulet because your astrology tells you it's really good, right? That is magic, right? We do this in a way with ancestors and we don't even realize it. When we're wearing an heirloom, let's say, you're given a ring by your bubby, right?
Yes.
And it's been passed down through the generations and it becomes a lucky charm to you. I have to put the bubby's ring on because I'm going somewhere special. That is ancestral veneration. And that's also blessing because that's a blessing, right? So that piece around utilizing ancestors in that way is to come into contact with them, recreate or strengthen those relationships so that you can then accept their hand and guiding blessings, right? In that way, it's magic. I often will argue against this idea of people going in like, I want to use my ancestors to get a car. I want to use my ancestors to get blah, blah, right? It doesn't work like that. Can you imagine going into, your great aunt's house and being like, okay, I want a new house. How are you going to help me with this, right? My culture, I'd be slapped upside the head, right? So instead, you build relationship. You build that foundation, and through that mutual support that's coming down the grapevine to you. Because in ancestral veneration that I've seen across the world, the underlying kind of idea of what the ancestors want for us is to create more ancestors. They want life to continue. And that's often usually through, procreation and the continuation of the world and whatnot, right? Now, what I've experienced is that I can be a good support to the rest of my family because I'm probably not going to have children, right? But I can still, through them supporting me, getting me into my healthiest place and getting me to be the most productive person I can be in my life, I can then add to the world and perpetuate the world. And that's really what the ancestors' main goal is. Very different from spirit guides, very different from the angels, very different from deities, right? So in that way, then, I appease the ancestors through my veneration practices, and through that, I then have an in to request, I need support with this, or can you help me guide me this? And people get these anyways. If you've ever had that nudge, or whenever you've smelt like perfume and it was like, your great grandmother's or something like that, right? And it's a reminder to you, that's the psychic that came on probably spoke about this, right? Receiving nudges.
Yes.
Oftentimes our ancestors are doing that for us too, right? So it's becoming aware of that through this veneration practice, which is the vehicle for relationship. And in that way, then magic can happen, right? But yeah, magic in other ways, like working with spirits or working with folk charms or something like that, ties into the ancestral practice because a lot of those folk charms, a lot of those magical practices are tied to culture. And of course, the folk, it's folk practice, right? It's practices that are passed down within the culture by your ancestors, right? So that current is really strong. I also practice other forms of magic too that aren't connected to my ancestors, but in those moments, I'm connecting with other ancestors, lineage ancestors, those who practiced that thing before me. I call them in or create those relationships. Yeah.
So it still plays a part in
Totally does.
in all of it. So, okay. So then in your practice or helping others, psychotherapy, is this something that you almost always recommend or have people do? Is it part of your process or is it only sometimes?
With psychotherapy, we have to be very, very cautious. It's like taking one hat off and put another, right? So I do work as a spiritual psychotherapist, which is really just a convoluted way of saying transpersonal, Jungian, all of these things, right? I often will. I like family stuff always comes up with therapy clients almost all the time. It's not so bad that I'm sat there writing mother, underlining it multiple times, right? But it does come up. It's
Right.
a big thing. So I can utilize some of the techniques in ancestral veneration practice. People have come to me. I often work within spiritual communities anyways, where people are interested in creating rituals for themselves. And then it just comes down to in name only, right? What is the difference between practicing ancestral veneration and setting up a memorial cupboard to your ancestors? It's just how you're looking at it, right? It's that intention of what's behind it, right? So, for me, I often will say, when we're dealing with, if we're interested in ancestor work and building relationships with our ancestors, I will offer them suggestions of techniques that they can use, exercises they can use within an appropriate framework. It really depends on what they're looking for. I think that's when the ethics of psychotherapy comes in. Somebody is dealing with mental health disorder or issue where, working through like visualizations or meditations or something like that could very negatively impact their specific mental health issue, and that's off the tables, right? But for most people I work with, I don't work with many people dealing with things like that. Most people, it's about connection, it's about building, and in which case all of these techniques are just ways of building those connections. Sometimes I do work with people who are interested in building like spiritual practices around their therapy stuff, in which case then it's catering then to what's healthiest for them, because spiritual bypass is a big problem for a lot of people who are in these spiritual communities. Have you come across that term before?
No, I was just going to say spiritual bypass. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Of course. So it's one of the dangers of working as a spiritual psychotherapist is people who are interested in spirituality will come. Like any other form of bypass, what it is when you replace one thing with another in order to ignore the first thing. Right? So those people who are really interested in working with their ancestors because they have family trauma, but they only want to work with their ancient pagan Celtic ancestors, that's it. They want to ignore all of the hundreds of generations in between or dozens of generations in between, because they are not the types of ancestors that they're interested in. With that, I would then look at narrative. I would look at how is my client relating to these ancient Celtic pagan ancestors, from Scotland 2,000 years ago. How is that group, or their perception of that group and the story that they've developed, impacting their own story and how they walk in the world now? That's as much ancestor veneration as sitting down and building an altar and all that, because we're looking then at what's their relationship. It all comes back down to the relationship. So I guess it's a difficult question to answer because there's so many elements to it.
No, but it did. I see where you're going with it, and that does make sense. And part of what you said earlier about how we're all doing magic, the lucky, hair tie or the jewelry that you're wearing. As a jeweler, I have done many a grandparents, ring or diamonds, or we've repurposed something into something else for the memories and everything. So I've definitely seen that firsthand. And the nudges you were talking about, I actually have said this, or I say this to my husband a lot, is just when I feel those, the nudge or what it feels. And I always tell him that everybody's just justifying them away, but that it's something more. Like how easy it is to just justify it as something else, but it's something more. So I just literally have validation right there from you that it is something more. So right there, I got some proof. I have another question about it. So you're very well known in your field. For people come to you that are specifically interested in this thing, like you said, you work with spiritual communities, etc. So if it's somebody else that you've met or anything else, what advice do you have for anybody who is struggling with any sort of maybe individuality, figuring out who they are, relationships, etc.? When do you think it would be? It's hard to word this question, but when would you think that what you have to offer is a good place for them to go forward and work through?
If we're speaking from a therapy point of view, again, it depends on what the thing is. I would say I would go into the narrative there. What is their relationship to their understanding of themselves as an extension of their family? I would also look at as they're engaging with new identities or emerging identities in themselves, how are they relating to the history and the community of those identities? A very good example would be somebody who comes out as queer or begins to understand they're on a gender journey, right? How are they relating to the ancestors of that community as they find themselves? Who are their heroes? This is something we all do. We all have our heroes, those people that we look up to in society, right? As we engage with different parts of ourselves, the number of people, and this is where it starts to get really like all over the place, but the number of people who have a favorite superhero or a favorite character from literature that seems to be with them throughout their life, and they keep coming back to that character, right? And they gain new insight about themselves as they enter into different phases of their life. A good friend of mine, Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, is a really big thing for her. And as she ages and she was going through relationships and she was entering into, a marriage, she kept thinking about what would Elizabeth do? Right? Because she found herself in that phase of her life. So it's one of those, with those, I would look at narrative, I would look at who are they connecting with, and what is the feedback loop there, as they explore deeper, what are they drawing from to feed that exploration? If they're looking at it from a spiritual practitioner point of view, I often will say, go and connect with these spirits. And I've experienced this myself. As I was doing that project for my psychotherapy training, I actually went and I sat down at a seance at a what's called a dumb supper, which is like a seance, but there are places that the dead can come and sit, and you just sit and you eat and commune with the dead. And I had a full conversation. How I experienced it in my head, it's kind of hard to describe it, but I experienced it as an ongoing conversation with my grandfather and my great-grandfather. And I asked them both really serious questions, because I found that as I was doing this research, I would get nudges to research a little bit more. Like if anybody who's been on ancestry.ca or .com, right? Suddenly the little thing pops up and you're like, suddenly, 4 hours later and you're in the middle of nowhere, right? It's like, oh wow, this whole branch of our family has opened up. The stories come out, right? You start to get nudges about what these stories were, what lives these people could have been living and how then they relate to you. And I found the spiritual connection was really strong there. And the more I engaged with that, the more I would get a hunch that then when I went and either asked my parents for verification, they verified, yes, this actually happened. Or I would find it in a record somewhere, right? And there's no other way to explain that apart from some deep connections, deep spiritual connection inside of me, reaching out to these individuals wherever they are, and that feedback and information. So I would say start to engage, and we can do this with any form of ancestor, whether it be biological, lineage, affinity, even fictional ancestors, which is also part of the book too. I've included that there too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What you just said about just really everything that you've talked about and then going back to the ancestors of where you came from and ancestral relationship, I feel like that's just skipped always. We're always going, this is us now. How can we move forward? We're forgetting to look at all of that. So that's a big, huge piece that's completely missed in anyone that I've brought on so far. I mean, we've discussed with the psychic and the clairvoyant about, contacting them and talking with them, but not necessarily about sitting down or making that a part of your life and learning and communing and growing with that as a part of it. So that I find really fascinating, because it's just not something that's ever come up before. And the benefits or the things that you can learn and take out of it seem exponential, seem like a lot.
It's huge. It's huge. And one last point on that is that's the reason I wrote the book. I was looking at the kind of pagan witch metaphysical scene, and in North America there's not that many books on it. The number of books I was able to find was something like 15 over the span of 20 years. Now others have come out since mine because it's become a big theme because of the pandemic, but the majority of the books out there, it wasn't on building a veneration practice. It was mourning. How do you mourn the dead? How do you, and I mean, I mean, to use something culturally specific for your background, right? It would be like sitting Shiva for 30 or 40 years, right? If we get stuck in mourning all the time and only seeing our relationship to the dead through mourning all the time, it would be like sitting on that low stool for the rest of your life. And that wouldn't, it doesn't do anything for you or the dead because they have places they need to go to. Same with you, right?
It's an excellent point. I also, well, that's an excellent point. But I also, while you were talking before about the Dumb Supper, it made me think, again, these are things I just from my experience growing up Jewish in the Jewish religion, but obviously I'm sure there's things in other religions, but we don't speak about it in the way that you speak about it. But absolutely at Passover, we leave an extra seat for Elijah. Just like you were saying, our ancestors from the past. So it's so interesting how it's here. It's in our everyday life. Nobody gives it a second thought, but it's truly what you are speaking of. And communing with your ancestors, ancestral veneration, part of magic, the nudges, all of that is literally incorporated in, well, for me, I see it in the Jewish religion because I was brought up it. I know you've mentioned all the other cultures that it's brought in. So it's a really new, interesting perspective or take of seeing it that way.
It's something that very particularly Western Protestant Europe disconnected us from. And that Protestant piece is really tied in with capitalism and that sense of individuality, right? That sense of we have to be individuals, we have us, right? That's not a norm when you look around the world. And that goes back to the most ancient of religions. I have a religious studies background, right? It goes all the way back. You see this in all of these different cultures. And you see this particularly in Catholic cultures, because there's an element of Catholicism, but when they came in and converted everybody, there was a tolerance of folk tradition, and that's often where you see ancestral veneration practices syncretizing with the main tradition, but often and so this is why South America has so many, right? Africa has so many traditions, right? Yeah.
I love that. I've got my brain is opened up right now. I've got so many things I want to look into. So, I mean, I've gotten all my questions answered. Hopefully that's what my listeners want to hear. But as a side note, you have so much to offer. Is there anything I missed maybe that you want to talk about or share?
So I'm kind of in between projects right now. So so the Ancestral book came out last year in September. I'm actually just finished a huge, massive, and I guess it's ancestral in a way, a huge, massive folklore book on witches and cunning folk, and again stories that were part of the world of life before the dawn of the 20th century. And a real deep dive in that. So I do have another book coming out spring 2025 through a publisher named Cross Crow Books over in Chicago. They are, if you're interested in magic, they're producing a lot of magical texts and folklore texts right now. They've just recently brought on somebody from two writers from Pakistan to talk about folklore of the Khyber Pass in Pakistan, which is really, really cool. So that book is going to be coming out spring 2025, and it's a deep dive into the stories of witches and the stories of cunning folk, which is an aspect of everyday life that has really disappeared. These are the people who you would have gone to get your fortunes told, to if you had a missing cow or missing money, you would go to them to get your fortune told, to tell you where they were. They were often also the ones that were giving you charms to protect your family. They were often also the midwives to the wise women, the wise men, and they were prolific. They were prolific in Europe, they were prolific in North America, and you still occasionally hear stories of them being told in the folklore of North America and Europe. So that's coming out soon, and in a way that is ancestral too, because these are the figures that, again, they're part of that folk background and the stories that we're told, and part of that communal culture. So I'm really excited about that. But more details for that will be coming out soon.
That's amazing. And 2 books in such a short time. And as a side note, well, just for me and listeners, I saw who you work with, publishers, the Llewellyn Cross, and I'm actually going to my bookshelf in the other room, well, actually multiple bookshelves in the other room, full of their books. I've got all kinds of things over there. So I just need to add yours onto it. But no, I said I'm going to add just in the comments or show notes just about, all the things that they talk about, how that's so perfect that you're working with them. And I also forgot to mention to our listeners that you have a podcast too, as well. So can you just quickly sort of let us know the topics and themes and what it's about so they can check it out as well?
Totally. So the podcast, very specific, very niche. The entirety of the guests, and I've got about 70 episodes up there now, are all pagan, metaphysical, witchcraft, occult authors. So many of them are through Llewellyn. Many of them are from some of the other publishers in North America there. And yeah, so we talk about their life, their work, and tons of people. These are some of the bigger names as well. So if people are interested, it's Essence Podcast with Ben Stimpson.
All right, and we'll link everything below as well to make it easy. But yes, definitely subscribe, because that's exactly what I did when I found out about it. And just our talk. Well, thank you so much for being here, Ben. But I wanted you to know.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, my brain has just opened up, and just some things that I want to look at just personally, but also as a side note, professionally, I got so many brainstorms of ways I can incorporate those things into jewelry right now.
It's huge.
Many things, because jewelry, I mean,
it's huge.
Hundreds, millions of years old, the way it's been, jewelry's been around forever, but just different ideas and things that I can incorporate just with the things that you talked about today. So that's really exciting, when it can also, get me excited on, both ways of what kind of things I can bring out or what kind of things I can make. So
that's awesome.
Appreciate that on a personal level for doing that. So I know that our listeners will also get something out of it. So thank you again so much. We're going to have everything linked below, everything about Ben, anything that we mentioned here. And please, if you found anything or know someone that would find anything we talked about interesting, go ahead and share it, like, subscribe, follow. That's how we keep this going. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.